Okay, so it was September 2,
2010.
2010, and we have here with us Edna Svec, Kathy Svec, Roger Volker, and Carol Volker. And I think what's interesting about this is that we have a lot of years in the neighborhood represented by people who just lived around the corner from each other for decades. Now, the Svecs moved in 1958, and the Volkers moved in 1967.
Right.
And what I think we'd like to get to first is what prompted you to move to the neighborhood? Why was it that you selected this place over any other place?
We had a very large family.
You already had a large family
Yes,
then?
9 children. And we had a bungalow up in South Hazel. And we needed more space. And housing was in very short supply at that particular time. And we looked all over for a place that would be big enough for our family. And we couldn't find anything. Many of the houses were in bad repair. And it just got to the point where we said, well, we're probably going to have to build a house.
Oh.
And there was a man in Ames by the name of Charlie Miller who had a lot of property. Did you know about Charlie Miller?
Everybody knows
Everybody
Charlie
knows
Miller.
Charlie Miller.
Well, that was a dry run there. So I can remember we had a great big kitchen in this bungalow, and I had a rocking chair in there, and I was sitting there looking at all the want ads and the for sale ads, and I came across this description, and we had looked at places, and they sounded great, but they turned out to be not so great. So I read this. Harry came home, and I said, oh boy, listen to this. So I read the description, and I said, what do you suppose that really looks like? And Harry was a man of few words. He didn't say anything. So later, he burst in the door and he said, oh, come on, get your coat, come. He was home for lunch. Come with me. And I thought, what in the world? So we came over and we looked at this place, and I thought, oh, if I can't have that house, I don't want to go on living.
Hey, how old was the house? You remember when it was built?
Oh, it's an
It
old
was
house.
built in something in the 18-somethings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a
And-
Tilden house.
70s,
The
80s maybe.
original,
1870s, 1880s.
original house was altogether different from what it turned out to be. This is a prairie style, and that one was
Italianate.
Italianate. It was a
Right,
Victorian.
right,
How big was it? How many bedrooms did it have?
how many bedrooms?
Well, there were 3 on the second floor, and one of the 3 was a part of a suite, so it was sort of the parents' suite.
The whole back of the house.
And then on the third floor, we created a dormitory, so all 4 of the boys that were old enough lived up on the third floor. So we created essentially probably 6 or 7 bedrooms out of the space in the house.
And was it unusual to have a family that size at that time? Were you considered pretty rare?
I think it was kind of rare. I know there were several families, Catholic families,
Well, see, I'd heard, farm families often were
Yes.
big like that, but I didn't know if city families were very large like
No,
that.
that was unusual. And
Okay.
I want you to know that I'm an only child.
How about your husband?
He just had one sister, so very small families. But Dick, I want Mom to tell about how we actually got the house.
Okay.
So if you would pick up with that.
Yes.
So you saw the house, you
They,
loved it.
they had a very difficult time selling that house because it was so large. And so the realtor came, and we talked about it, and he said, well, why don't you make an offer? And Harry said, well, okay, so he sat down, and it was something like 3,800 and some cents. You know, Harry was very precise. So he went back to talk to the owners of the building, and about 20 minutes later he said, you just bought yourself a house. Wasn't that a bargain?
You know, I had heard that your house at one time was a fraternity when ISU kicked the fraternities off campus. Is that right?
It was a Sigma Nu.
Sigma Nu.
And
Okay.
the one right across we owned was also a fraternity.
Oh, so there were two
For sure.
fraternities right
Oh,
here
there
in the
was
neighborhood.
a lot of them in the neighborhood.
Sharon Worth's was.
Yeah,
Oh, now why did they kick the fraternities off
I don't know that.
I think they considered them secret societies. And they just didn't fit with the university's goal of open
And now,
membership.
when was this? The 20s?
Oh. Earlier, I think, slightly earlier, I think.
Yeah, the one, I think I have a photograph of the 829 Douglas, and it was 1914 or 16 when it was a fraternity.
Now then, let's hear from the Volkers. Now, what was it that prompted you to buy this house, and you bought it in 1967?
66 in the fall.
66.
We wanted a fireplace, and
Oh, we had a list of things that we wanted in a house, and this gave us most of the things. It
Yeah.
didn't have a separate dining room at that time. We built this dining
Now,
room.
you had 3 children.
Yes.
Did you have 3 when you moved in?
yes.
And there was ample bedroom space for them? Or
Yeah, there's
3 bedrooms upstairs.
Yeah.
And then there's the 3rd floor that when the kids were older, 2 at a time slept up there.
Yeah, plenty of space. We just liked old things, and I collect stuff you can't believe. And this has a lot of little nooks and crannies. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what the neighborhood, as you recall, was like back when you moved in, especially compared to what it's like today. Is it still like it was, or has it changed a lot?
Well, when we moved in, there were no children.
No children, huh?
No, up and down the street. But then eventually, families with children moved in. But we only, Douglas only went up about as far as 13th Street, as I remember. Beyond that, it was not built up.
And what are your recollections?
My biggest, bitterest recollection is this shack that was next door, which was owned, I don't know if I should name names, but it was owned by a prominent person who was a slumlord, and we finally, with 2 neighbors, bought it. The 3 of us bought it for $7,500 in '72.
Right
Tore
here
it down.
next-
Right next
Where,
door.
where you're sitting, you'd be
Where
sitting
you're
inside.
sitting was the lot line.
Oh,
Yeah, and it was squeezed
Actually, it was
in.
inside the lot.
We had almost no kitchen, and we contemplated moving at one time, but we were able to pull that off.
what was it occupied?
Oh yeah, it was rented. A whole string of renters. It was one
Well,
of
it was
these.
divided up into 3 apartments,
Yeah.
and
Wow.
it apparently wasn't very nice because they never stayed very long.
What about the history of rental property here in the neighborhood? Was it dominated by single family residences when you lived here,
I think so.
or were there a lot of houses that have been cut up into apartments like we find today?
Yeah, there were, and they still remain.
The big ones.
The big ones, and furthermore, I think people in those days would rent a room or two just to make a little extra money. I mean, after all, it was right after the war, in the 50s and 60s, and so it was a source of income. And many of those rental properties are still here. The one right across the street, well, all over the place.
What about the relationship with the hospital? First of all, I've heard, I don't know, I've never checked it out, that when in the early days of Mary Greeley, many of the doctors lived in this neighborhood and
Never
would
heard that.
walk back and forth to the hospital.
I don't,
Is that not?
I don't recall that.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. Did you, Have doctors ever lived in this neighborhood? Mary Greeley personnel
Not
of
that
any
I know.
number? Any?
I'm not aware of
Well,
that.
except
Who
Captain Greeley
did? Who lived in a lot of these big houses?
Oh, that's a very important question, and there are a lot of important answers to that. The editor of the newspaper, or they had more than one newspaper, lawyers, judges, up and down Douglas in the very early days, and they built the big
the
houses.
Munns, the lumberyard
Yeah.
people, the Curtises,
The Curtis and
the
Pamels, big names at the college, lived on Duff.
Were most of those people gone by the time you moved in?
They were
Yeah.
all gone.
It was becoming the hole in the donut, which is an urban concept, apparently, that if you let a city mature over time, the fringes will be the
Vitality.
affluent, and in the middle you get slums and decrepit buildings and so forth and so on. And in this neighborhood, what happened was the realtors and developers would buy those things, tear them down, and build 4 and 6 plexes. And there are a fair number of those scattered throughout this Old Town neighborhood. We finally just got sick of it and said, let's put a stop to it. And that's where the historic district came in.
Okay, but let's talk a little bit more about the hospital. Did the neighborhood feel under pressure from the hospital even back when you first moved in, or was there a kind of relationship that was satisfactory?
I don't have any recollection.
Well, of course, Douglas still went through, all the way
Yeah.
through, and
Yeah.
so the front door of the hospital was still on Douglas when we moved in. And so it was a very easy walk up to the hospital. And the houses, went right up to, what is that?
Right across the street from it.
9th, 10th, yeah, up to at least about 10th Street at the time that we moved in. So it was really more of a little local enterprise,
Yeah, the hospital was. It had
Yes.
not yet become a regional
right,
facility and needed all that parking
right.
and all that. And McFarland wasn't up there either, was it?
No,
No.
It was houses. I think the front door, Kathy, was on 11th Street, and you
maybe
entered.
so.
You walked south to get into it.
Okay. Okay.
And I clearly remember all the houses that were there. One of our kids would be dropped off at a babysitter in a house right across from the hospital.
Okay. And,
I'll go get that.
But just as a footnote, Dick, really, during the course of my memory there, 1958, at least through high school and when I started at college at Iowa State, then we began to see the expansion of the hospital and the tearing down of those houses. So those events are certainly within my memory.
and it probably happened within 1 or 2 different phases.
Right.
I think when McFarland expanded, they knocked down quite a few. And then when the hospital expanded or needed parking, they knocked down
They
quite a
knocked
few
down
also.
a few, and then there were little pocket parking lots. They'd knock down a couple of houses and then just pave just a couple of lots.
Well,
And
they
so-
didn't always pave them. I mean, they dumped gravel on top of the yards and people were parking on top of that and it was coming this way and we could kind of see that if it didn't stop, we were gonna be out of house.
Now, what about this neighborhood's relationship with downtown? Now, there was no North Grand Mall,
Right.
and so the retail hub of town was
Main Street.
Main Street.
Still is largely.
And there were 2 hardware stores, several ladies' dress shops, I think 3 men's apparel stores.
Hotel. 2 hotels. The Historic Society's in the building where one of them used to be.
But all of the big retailers, Penny's,
That's right.
Montgomery Ward,
Yonkers.
Yonkers.
were all on Main Street, and we certainly all.
Children's.
Children's
Yeah.
was there. They were a
The
big
fair,
enterprise.
remember that
Fair
store?
store was so fun.
Was there a
Fair store, remember the fair store?
Yeah.
was there a
Yeah.
grocery store in downtown Ames?
At one time there was.
Where was it?
It was on the south side of the street,
What was it?
Which street?
Main Street.
Main
Yeah.
Street.
What was it? What was it? It wasn't Fairway.
Just a little
I
neighborhood.
don't know,
No,
the
no.
Fairway moved several times. It was where what is it, that the.
Just south of the Methodist Church. That was
Oh,
It was
Fairway.
there.
Oh,
But
yeah.
before that, it was across the street where that bicycle place is.
Yeah. Well, so
that's
did you
what-
see a lot of people walking from the neighborhood downtown to do their shopping?
Oh, yes, it was so easy.
Uh,
Nobody had cars.
Convenient. You could walk downtown and do all of your business.
Yeah, McFarland was down there, the doctor's offices
Yes.
were down there, dentist's office were down there.
Yeah,
Oh, yes, they were, that's right.
yeah,
that's
in the
right,
old
that's
Tribune
right.
building.
So it was a very, very convenient.
Very convenient, very.
Now, how would you get back and forth between campus and the neighborhood?
Well, they had the dinky, you know, this
Well, that was a long time
a
for
long
us.
time before that. But the tracks for that ran right down the middle of Main Street in around the turn of the century.
But when we moved here, actually, there wasn't a real usable bus system,
No.
so you did drive to campus and
Or
back.
bicycle.
Or bicycle.
Was
How
that,
did Harry get back and forth to work
Ah,
right after you moved? Do you remember? Did he drive?
he
Did
drove
he
the
ride a
Izetta.
bicycle?
No, he never rode a bicycle.
Okay.
He must have
He
driven.
must have driven.
Must have driven.
He had a one-cylinder car called an Izetta.
Oh, later, yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah.
An infamous car.
Mhm.
now, what about the whole issue of the group homes? How long have they been here?
Well, I think George Belitzos started that in a place called the Bus Stop, which was near a bus stop down on Lincoln Way in the early 70s, when there was a lot of experimentation with drugs and other wild things. And it evolved into youth and shelter services.
Has the neighborhood always been home to, or for ever since the 70s, then has it been home to more or less group homes, whether, you know, battered women's center and other kinds of,
Yeah, in and
Group
out.
homes.
I mean, some have come and then have moved elsewhere where they could have better facilities or enlarged.
But by their nature, they don't publicize themselves a lot, so they're very quiet, and I'm not aware of any. Were you aware of group homes in the neighborhood, Edna?
Like by the time you moved, I'm thinking, you know, we moved out in 1988. I'm trying to remember if some of those were in the neighborhood at that time. Do you remember? Like the women's shelter over on Duff?
I don't remember.
Don't remember. They don't seem, you're right, they were quiet.
Yeah, and
And
the
they
women's
don't
shelter
seem-
was a secret for a long
Especially
time.
quiet, they didn't have people.
And they were not prominent, I think, during the time that we lived in the neighborhood, so.
But I think the fact that they were here is indicative of the kind of attitude that you still find in Old Town, and that is the people are somewhat independent, and yet they accommodate to a lot of different things. Try putting a group home over in the campus residentials or up at Northridge. It just wouldn't work.
how about the relationships with renters? Has that, and it seems to me that we've got quite a few renters now in the neighborhood who are students, maybe graduate students, but still students. Was that the case back then, that we had, the neighborhood had a lot of renters? And what kind of rent, were they students? Or
Some
were they
Hospital workers,
hospital workers?
service personnel.
There was some kind of across the street and then to the north just a little bit. I remember a rental house there. But I don't remember much about the people who lived there though. But really all of the houses just immediately to the north of us, on Douglas on the west side, between 9th and 10th, those were all single family
Even the one
dwellings.
on the corner up there?
Yeah, I think so. Do you remember next to Mrs.
Husband?
Husband? Was that a rental or was that a?
I have a feeling I think it was probably a duplex.
Duplex, maybe, yeah. But even around the corner on 10th Street, there was a little ranch-style house kind of fitted in there, little bungalow, and that was a single family. And it may have been a rental, but it was more of a family rather than students. So, you know, and I think immediately across the street were still families. Now, I remember Caddy Corner, where the park is now.
Mhm.
That was the big Judge
Judge's,
Stevens
mhm.
home. And I remember that house was just huge, and it was a rental.
Half a block long.
It was.
Hey, let's talk about the history of that block over, or that lot over there.
Where the
Yeah.
park is.
At Ninth and
Ninth
Douglas,
and Douglas.
because I think it has really played an important role in the evolutionist department of this neighborhood. I mean, I think it's really become a focus for the neighborhood. Now, what happened there?
Well, neighborhood parks began, I think, in the 70s and 80s, and there are something like 30 of them in Ames now.
The real
A
small
whole
ones.
slug of them.
Yeah, that's only about, what, 50 feet wide and
It's
200
that's
feet,
right. It's
200 feet wide
a
down.
standard house lot that's just turned into a park. And the house could have been preserved probably, but it wasn't. And then the city, I believe, or a developer wanted to put an eightplex in, and I think I still got the plans for that because it was a big deal in the neighborhood. But a lot of us got upset because we didn't want an eightplex in that spot. So,
And then what happened?
Well, I don't really know what happened, but I suspect that maybe the city didn't get the money that they thought they were going to or something. Because it then just kind of evaporated and there was nothing there, so then the neighborhood said, why don't we have a park or something there, and so that's what we got.
But the house had gotten quite dilapidated. of
Yeah, it
course.
was really
It
run
was
down.
really,
One
really run
single
down.
guy lived there, and I think he maybe had some tenants in there, I would think so.
But it always fascinated me because it looked like at one time it was quite a grand
yes,
house.
Oh, yeah.
yes.
Quite a
That's
grand
beautiful.
house.
Beautiful woodwork inside. And the interesting thing about that is the fact that it had these great big
Brackets.
brackets up by the
under the
roof.
soffit.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Under
You-
the
you've-
eaves.
Ornate.
Yeah.
And Harry salvaged 4 of those.
Oh,
And he made a round table,
oh,
a sturdy round table, and he used those
to hold it up as the,
As
as the
a
leg.
pedestal.
Have you still got the table?
The
You
the
still
Do you
have
table.
have the table?
it was an outdoor table.
Oh.
Has now one of our sons has it out on his patio.
I remember that in your backyard. Yeah, I remember that table.
Oh, those brackets are beautiful.
Oh yeah.
And sturdy.
Hmm.
Let's talk a little bit about the schools. Now, it was the neighborhood school back when your kids were here and your kids were here, at least the public neighborhood school was Wilson or Beardshire?
Beardshire.
Beardshire, yeah.
And it was the location where Wilson Beardshire is now.
Yeah.
Yes.
Except it was an old school, is that right?
An old building, and in 71 or 2, we militated to get an addition put on. It was a gymnasium. And it turns out that once they tore the old building down, the gym stayed and they added new structure to it. So that gym, that was an addition, became an integral part of the new building.
But let's back up a little
Yeah.
bit, you're talking about the new building. It was the neighborhood school,
First grade school in Ames, do you think?
no.
No.
And then they did add the gym, but it wasn't torn down while it was still a
Now, did your
neighborhood
kids
school.
all go there?
For part of their school year, yes.
It
So-
was
But then
closed
they
in
had-
73.
Mhm. So then they went to Roosevelt the rest of their,
And what was the justification for closing it? Why was it closed?
Well,
it and Harlan were closed at the same time.
I think generally, if you want to close a school, you shift the boundaries where that supply the kids. And if you manipulate those boundaries in such a way that there aren't any students to go to the school, then you can say, there's nobody to go to this school, we don't need it anymore.
It was also a single unit school,
Mhm.
and they said they wanted to have,
One class level per,
Yeah.
or one class per grade level?
That's
except
right.
as part of the baby boomers, there were two classes. I know that our son Christopher had 2 kindergartens and 2 first grades, but Timothy had just 1. That's when the baby boomers.
And so the neighborhood was upset when its neighborhood school was being
Oh,
Yes, they
threatened.
were.
yeah. Traditionally, if you ever want to close a school or a church anywhere, you can galvanize the population into action. And we've seen that as school districts in Iowa have shifted. And that happened on a small level here in Ames.
And then, so that school closed, and this neighborhood then started going
Part
to...
of them went to Roosevelt and part of them went to Meeker.
Uh-huh. I think, though, this neighborhood generally considers Roosevelt its neighborhood school.
Well, it does now,
Yeah.
but it wasn't then.
Well, it didn't. It was not then.
But I don't know, the
But I
demographics
think-
have
yeah.
shifted to
I
them.
think within the historic district, that would be the Roosevelt, but part of the Beardshire district went on up north outside of the,
Now, the Svec children that went to a public school, which one, elementary school, which one did they go to?
Our children went to the Catholic school,
And then what? But
and
did
then they went to the Central
middle school,
Middle
or
School.
junior high?
downtown.
But Lillian went to Beardshire.
Oh, right, right.
and then she
Did,
must
did
have
Ben
gone
go,
as well.
did
Daniel.
Daniel? So the last two of our big clan went to Beardshire, went to
And
public school.
none of your siblings went to Roosevelt then?
Lillian
No.
must have. No,
No, huh?
didn't Lillian?
Yes, Lillian and
Went to
Daniel.
Roosevelt?
No,
No, she
no,
didn't. She must have
Lillian
just
and Daniel went to Beardshire, so
Oh.
they were probably some of the last
Yeah.
classes that went to school in Beardshire. And boy, that was great. It was so easy for them to walk just a couple blocks over to
How
Beardshire.
They
busy?
could come home for lunch.
Yeah.
How busy was Duff at that time?
Do you remember?
Was Duff a busy street then?
Crossing
Did they
They
have
had
a
a
crossing
traffic
guard?
guard. They had
They
a
did?
crossing guard.
I don't think it was so terribly busy, do you? Was it?
I don't think it was as busy as it is now, but
Oh,
it was
no,
busy enough
no.
that they had a crossing guard there.
Yeah.
And so now the neighborhood, more or less, is going through the same thing with the loss of Roosevelt School. But anyway,
Anyway, that's another story.
yeah. Let's talk about a little bit about the rezoning, the effort to rezone, and not up to the creation of the district, but you know the effort to downzone
Yeah.
and how that all went and what happened.
I'm hazy on how it all went, but I remember Harry had a ditto machine, and he would crank out notices of the neighborhood getting together to talk about these issues. I think downzoning or creation of special zoning was regarded as probably the best legal way to put the brakes on tear downs and reconstruction.
That's what they were attempting to address there.
Yes, that's right.
A tear down, or it would have reduced the number of buildings that could be converted into apartments. It would have reduced the density.
Well, no, because they would build a fourplex or eightplex.
No, you put a fourplex where an original single family was, you quadrupled its capacity and increased the tax
Well,
base.
would it have prevented the knocking down, the tearing off of these old houses? Is that what it would have done?
Zoning?
Yeah.
Yeah,
The
essentially.
downzoning.
Essentially, that's what it did. On the basis, there were 2 or 3 reasons for that. One is you tear down a structure that's got some historic significance, you never get it back. Secondly, the argument that the sills are rotted or the roof leaks, those are not valid arguments because you can restore. And many countries in the world do restore. Many people here now restore furniture and cars and everything else. It was a fight. It came down to be a fight between the developers and the residents of the neighborhood.
Do you remember any of that, Mom? No.
What about the more or less the size of Ames back in the 60s and the 70s? Now there was no North Grand Mall.
Mm-hmm.
Where was the high school? Was it downtown? Where
The new school out north, there's a present high school, was built in '63. Prior to that, the high school was downtown by where the Fairway store is.
was
Now City Hall.
Was the high school considered out on the fringe of town?
Yeah, it was on the fringe. Matter of fact, they built it on the edge of a prairie, which is still preserved, a natural prairie. 9th Street here was the original North line of demarcation, and then it became 13th to be the edge, and then I think it'd be 20th or 24th Street. There's some major east-west streets.
24.
24th. Yeah.
When you moved in, where did the city end on the north?
On the north, I think probably around 13th Street.
That quick, huh? And then you'd be in the country.
Mm-hmm.
Mom, do you remember in those early years, the late 50s, early 60s, going to Carr's Pool?
Oh.
Do you remember houses between our house and Carr's Pool? Because Carr's was up on 16th Street. And I certainly remember riding bikes and walking to Carr's Pool as a kid. But I don't have a lot of recollection, but I'm pretty sure that we walked through neighborhoods to get there.
Was 13th Street an important thoroughfare back during that time? Did it extend to, I don't know what highway, before 35 was put in?
There wasn't a highway out
There
there.
wasn't anything out there.
No, 69 was the big, and that's right in town.
69.
There was an old bridge, a rickety bridge, across the river on 13th, down in the floodplain. But I don't recall that place going anywhere. Except as undergraduates, we would explore the back gravel roads on date nights. Thought the camera would like to know.
Yes, right.
Doesn't 13th Street run into Innis Grove Park?
No.
No?
No.
Innis Grove is north of 13th, isn't it?
Yeah, but it could have been couldn't it have been the southern, well, I don't know how far south Innis Grove extended.
Because Innis Grove was more around 20th to
Yeah.
24th.
That's right.
I know we had some friends who lived up on 13th and we thought they were practically out of town.
Out of town.
And there was, 2-mile gap between the town and the campus back then? I mean, Brookside Park wasn't in place, was it?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
It was.
It's the same gap they've always had. It hasn't changed because it's all floodplain. And of course, where the Iowa State Center was not built at that time.
Yeah.
But the basic locus of control for the business section and the college, those 2 points have stayed constant ever since the college was formed.
What was your recollection of Campus Town? Did you go to Campus Town for any reason? What was in Campus Town?
You mean the city part of it?
Yeah, I mean,
Commercial
The
part.
commercial part,
Yeah.
Dogtown, we call it
Yeah.
Dogtown.
Did it appeal at all to people on this side of town?
I don't think we patronized the shops up there in Campus Town. We stayed down in the old part of the city.
It was a microcosm of Main Street, a drugstore, a grocery store,
A men's clothing
men's
store.
clothing,
Movie
a
A
big-
theater.
women's clothing store?
2 theaters,
There was a jewelry store.
uh-huh. A tobacco shop right on the corner where one of the copy centers is.
Candy store, remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Now, did young people, who were not college students, did you go over to Campus Town for any particular reason?
No. Really, as junior high and high school students, our focus was downtown. It was on the school. Of course, the stadium was still down where,
Target Center.
where the
Mhm.
Target Center used to be.
Oh, that was the
Hy-Vee.
football?
Oh, big stadium.
Big stadium was down there, and so so many of our activities revolved around school activities, and the schools were right downtown. So that
So there was really,
the focus
wasn't
of our
much
life.
reason to go to Campus Town. Now, did students patronize, ISU students, did they patronize downtown much?
Not much, because there really wasn't a real active bus system, and it just
No.
seemed too far to go. I'm thinking of when
And
I
if
was
they
an
had Campus Town, it
undergraduate.
was pretty vital.
Yeah.
Yeah, everything you
were
wanted
pretty
was
much
out
on
there.
foot, and so unless you had a car, you didn't get downtown very often.
There would be no reason to come down here except for the bars. There were some real notable beer
Yes,
beer
in
place.
fact, I heard Campus Town was dry for a long.
Oh.
And
When we
students
moved
had to come here to drink, downtown to drink.
in '67, when we moved it, Memorial Day of '67, I was going to treat the movers to a beer, and I had a heck of a time finding a place to buy any beer in town. It was no grocery stores. It was dry. Yeah.
I remember when people used to go to Nevada to get their booze.
Yeah.
That's right, that's right.
That's where the liquor
right.
store was.
Nevada, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Now let's talk a little bit about the more or less well-known people that have lived in the community, lived in Old Town. And I think we have everybody from Nick Nolte, the movie star. Now, what was he doing here?
He went to Beardshire School. In fact, there's a photograph of Dennis Wendell in the Ames Historical Society and Nick Nolte in the same class at Beardshire. Ted Kuzer.
Now, let's
Okay.
now, Nolte lived right here on Douglas, is that right?
I don't think.
823 Douglas.
Yeah, but wasn't it an uncle or somebody lived there? Did Nick Nolte live in that house?
He lived in that house, I think. From what I hear, I didn't.
And
didn't
so his
know.
family was here too.
Yeah.
Do you know what they did in Ames?
I don't know.
I don't know, and I'm not sure they were here a real long
No,
time.
and they weren't.
Maybe his father was in school or something. I don't know.
Peter Schickley, the PDQ Bach guys,
Yes.
he lived in Ames.
But did
his
he live
dad-
in this neighborhood?
No,
I don't
he lived
think
more over toward like on what's the name of that
South.
street? Riverside,
Yeah.
I think, or something. in that
His
area.
father worked for the USDA.
Now let's
And
talk
the-
about Ted Kuzer.
His dad managed
He's a
the
Pulitzer
Yonkers.
Prize-winning poet.
Yeah, he was poet laureate of the United States for 2 sessions in a row. Yeah, he grew up right down the street here on 9th.
Yeah, in a small house. Now his dad
Small
was
Managed Yonkers.
downtown Yonkers.
But worked first at Tilden's, at the Tilden
Yeah.
store. Did you ever know Mr. Kuzer at Tilden's store? It was probably before we moved into the neighborhood.
Did you know Abe Mezvinsky, who had the Ames Fruit and Groceries? And they live in the brick house right on
A
the
couple
corner.
of our children worked for him.
Oh, did they?
Now
Tom
where
and Jean,
Tom and Jean,
now
yes.
where was his store then?
That street.
up on, wasn't it where?
Where Car Hardware, where the Ace Hardware store is.
the
And
And
hardware
let's
store.
give some context here. Abe is the father of what's his name?
His son Mezvinsky ran into hard times financially, and he was a congressperson.
From Iowa City, the
Yeah.
Iowa City District. He voted on the impeachment of Richard Nixon. I think he cast some deciding vote on the Watergate. Anyway, and then it was his. Yes, he ran afoul of the law.
Yes.
Spent some time in prison, and then it was his son, however, who married Chelsea Clinton.
Yeah, Abe Mezvinsky's granddaughter. And Abe had 3 stores. There was the North Side Ames Fruit and Grocery, the downtown Ames Fruit.
Now this would have been what years?
Oh, after the war. I think he may have started them before the war.
I don't remember that.
Well, I think he started.
So
with
there were
the
no
one on
chain
the second-
grocery stores in Ames at the time of Mezvinsky?
Yes, there were.
There were?
Well, there was a. During the time we were here, there was a Fairway, and there was a.
Was Mezvinsky still in business then?
Yeah.
He was.
He had a west side, a downtown, and a north side.
The
3 of
downtown
them.
wasn't right downtown, it was
No.
on North Second or something
Right,
like that.
right.
And so the
Small.
first chain grocery store in Ames was probably Fairway?
I think so.
No, I don't know.
Safeway on South Lincoln, the Duck.
Oh.
Safeway was there.
Not before Fairway was north of the Sheldon Munn Hotel.
Okay, when we came in '62, Safeway was already there on Duck Avenue.
Yeah.
But our family shopped at Rushing's.
Yeah.
That's right.
Rushing's.
I
and
remember.
Where was that?
Rushing's was south of the railroad tracks between Kellogg and Douglas, if it had come through.
Mhm.
Oh,
It
there's
was
nothing.
kind of
There's
in the
there's
middle of
nothing
the
there
block.
now.
Yeah,
The
there is.
halfway house.
It's a
It's
group
the halfway
home.
house.
It's a group home, halfway house.
Oh.
It's
on the
tucked
side.
away back in there, but that was a big store.
Uh-huh.
Edna, where did you buy groceries when you lived here?
Well, Rushings and then Fairway,
I think it was mostly Rushings,
yeah. Did you go to Ames Fruit and Grocery?
rarely.
Rarely.
It wasn't in our neighborhood.
Right, it was a little, yeah, it was easier, it was closer to go to Rushings. But I remember when Fairway was in the building that's now across from the post office.
Yeah.
You know, we would walk home from St. Cecilia's, and one of the chores was always stopping in the Fairway and getting bread, and then walking on home to 9th and Douglas.
But prior to that, Kathy, they had a store right west of the city hall, the old city hall in the corner, Fatso Drugstore.
Right.
That was
right,
a
right,
Fairway.
That was a Fairway
original
originally, sure.
Fairway.
Hey, was that underpass in on Grand when you would go to?
Oh, yeah,
Oh,
oh, yeah,
it
it
was
was
built in
built
39.
38, 39,
Do
yeah.
any of you remember a derailment at that underpass?
I do.
Do you?
I remember that
The
vaguely, just vaguely.
freight cars fell off down into
yes.
and
Oh,
blocked
did he really fall down into the...
the highway.
Yeah,
Yeah.
nobody got hurt though, I remember that. It's
Yeah.
amazing.
Well, let's see. Is there any?
They trucked all the dirt from that under. Did you ever consider what happened to all of the soil they had to remove to build that under?
No.
They trucked it west on Lincoln Way and built it up around where the bridge between was it Squaw Creek is, yeah. Because there was a bridge there, they had to reconfigure that whole area, and they used the dirt for that.
Hey, did where the Iowa State Center is now? Did it flood rather regularly?
No,
It
I
didn't
don't
flood.
remember.
I don't remember it flooding. Used to be corn and stuff.
Yeah, big
That's
cornfield
right,
down there.
Fields, yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. And the park, I don't remember Brookside Park
Flooding.
flooding.
No.
Do you remember, did Brookside Park ever flood when we lived on
Brookside?
Douglas? Yeah.
Well, I remember it flooding at one
I
time.
remember one
It was
flood.
before
We had a
'93.
picnic and we were just getting ready to fold up our things and leave, and it started to rain. And the next morning there had been a flood.
Flood
It kept raining
through
and
the
it
park.
flooded.
Yeah. Oh, I'll be darned.
But I don't
Okay.
remember when that was.
Yeah.
But we just got our stuff out of the way before the real rain came
Mhm.
down.
Yep. Yep.
Right. How, Roger, I've asked you this question before, but how do you view the vitality of the neighborhood today? You know, considering it's it is the oldest one in Ames.
It's interesting you'd ask, because just last night, the Historic District Board of Directors met with the hospital administrator to talk about the new big high-rise that they want to build for Mary Greeley. And it's deja vu all over again, because we used to regularly meet with hospital people as they expand. I think the vitality is about the same. I sense there's still the eagerness of the neighborhood to maintain its character. And they just don't want, they have a very strong sense of community in this neighborhood. But they don't manifest that a lot. I mean, we don't see our neighbors much. I don't think we were ever in your house.
I was.
You were?
Well, didn't you say some of the Svec kids still babysat your
Yeah,
kids?
they did, and we would see them, and I'd talk to Harry and Edna over the fence. But so there's the degree of independence, but there's also a degree of caring about the neighborhood, and it's fairly stable. There wasn't a lot of move in and move out in those days.
Do you sense that there are as many, were there a lot of long-term residents in the neighborhood when you know, in your early years here? Or was it rare for someone to have spent, 50 years living in this neighborhood?
Oh,
When
I
you-
know of people who have, and when we, Edna was speaking a little bit ago about there not being any children when they moved
yeah.
here, and then there were some. And we, having lived here for 43 years, have found that the case. There were a lot of young children when we moved here, and then they all grew up and there were no children. Now it's full of children again, and we're the grandparents practically of all these children who live on the block. But in a few years, they're gonna be gone, so that's just the way neighborhoods.
The neighborhood keeps renewing itself. There's housing. Do you see this as housing that, I don't know, as affordable housing? Is this,
yeah.
is this a first,
Fixer-upper, do-it-yourself houses. If you want to restore and enjoy working on an old, whatever it is, car or house or furniture, this is the place. And people buy in this neighborhood because of that. And there's evidence of it all over the place.
I am surprised at times. I run into people in Ames and I mention where I live and they say, oh yeah, I lived in that neighborhood at one time. You know, it's just very, very common
Yeah.
for people to have made their first home purchase here and then, you know, spent several years here, decade here, and then they moved on.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention a couple of things.
Sure.
Dick, I don't know whether it's on your question list or not, but in terms of how the kids, how all of us kids entertain themselves, you know, right here in the neighborhood.
Okay, what would you do?
Well, one of the things that we did was we would walk down to the Collegian Theater.
And that's on
And-
Main Street?
On Main Street, the Collegian, you remember the Collegian Theater.
Oh, of course.
And Joe Gebrocht regularly had movies specifically for children. And they would be in the mornings, I think, on Saturday mornings. And they were so fun because he'd get all those kids in and he'd do door prizes. And it was always just so exciting to wait and see if you got a door prize. And one time I
All the
got a
kids
door
turned
prize.
out?
I got a door prize. It was a little set of china, you know, a little doll set of china, and I still have that doll set of china. But it was so fun, and Joe would also have special showings for school children, and I remember practically the entire St. Cecilia's school walked down to see one of those big Cecil B. DeMille. It was either Ben-Hur or the Ten Commandments, either one, but all the Catholic kids were there, you know, in the theater watching this movie.
And so where was that theater?
Well, it was located on
Next
the
to the
corner of
bank.
Burnett and Main, and the bank has that
You
building
know where
now.
Lukelands
Yeah.
is, it's
Yeah.
right across north.
And how do you spell this fellow's name?
Gerbracht, Gerbract. And the other thing we would do, of course, we had kind of a double lot there on the corner of 9th and Douglas, and it had a huge yard.
Did you have trees along it like you did now?
Yeah, big trees. Except that whole side yard was open, and that would be our multi-purpose athletic field. We would play football and
Yeah.
tag and dodgeball and just everything you can think of. And after the neighborhood turned over and there were young families again, the Svecs were kind of the magnet for all the activity in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Hide and seek through all the backyards, and it really was great fun. And then in the winter, we would walk down to the cemetery and sled down the cemetery hill.
And do you remember those great big snow sculptures you kids used to make
Yes.
in the yard?
In your yard?
In the yard. We would roll up all the snow in the whole side yard and make, one year it was a big tiki head, and one year it was a big Snoopy sitting on top of his doghouse.
What about ice skating? Did you do any ice skating?
You know, we did. We went down, they would flood the tennis courts down at Brookside Park.
Oh.
So we would walk down. There was a little shed where you could kind of, you know, change and put on your boots, and there was always a barrel with a fire going in it. And that was fun.
I remember Harry used to have those kids out working on Saturday morning, just like a full of ants, you know. And the yard always looked so beautiful, it was so well maintained. And I thought, golly, I wish I could get my kids working like Harry is working.
Well, I remember how he used to do the Christmas lights
Oh,
on the
yes.
big, what was it, Douglas fir or Colorado blue spruce right over there. I mean, that was an intricate operation to get those lights all the way
Well,
to the top of that
He
tree.
got it, he would use a ladder, and then he made an extension on a pole to get it way up to the top.
Yeah, yeah.
Somebody asked me one day, how does Harry get way up there?
Yeah.
And I said, oh, he would just rent a cherry picker.
Yeah, almost a helicopter, you and me. Okay, well, anything else anyone wants to say? I think I've got about all of the questions answered anything you want to say?
No, it's an hour and 20 minutes, I mean, an hour, it's about 50 minutes right now, so.
Okay, I think that's.
I think one thing should be said, though, if anyone looks at this with serious intent. Some of the questions you asked could be answered objectively. For example, when did the boundary move from 13th Street to 24th Street?
Right.
You could easily answer that by looking at the real estate holdings to see when houses were built. You could also answer the question, how many cars, what was the traffic like? Because all you'd have to do would be look at the car registrations for Story County. And you could probably see the growth of that.
Hey, did you feel was this neighborhood affected greatly when we had the influx of college students after World War II and the GI Bill? Was this did it flood into here?
I think so. The 829 Douglas, which we used to own, had 3 apartments in it, and it fairly obviously was done about wartime or right after wartime, because some of the divisions were done with cornboard kind of things.
The building materials they used, you could
Yeah.
date when it was done.
Yeah,
And
and
they turned
I
that-
think there was a real housing shortage when the veterans came
Oh, yeah.
and came back to school and all, and a lot of big homes were made into apartments at that time, because there were no apartment buildings in Ames, really. There was the Cranford Apartments in Campus Town, and another couple of smaller ones out, but there weren't any apartment buildings at all.
Do you remember, Mom, if there were any extra people living in 905, after the war? Do you remember anything about that?
Were there any what people?
Students.
Living at 905.
From the people that we bought the house from, the Linderoths.
Linderoths.
Did they ever house college students that you knew of?
Did they have?
House college students
No.
after the war?
No.
Did they build that house for a big family?
No, they did not build that house. That house was, it was a fraternity house at first. And then a man by the name of Tilden bought the house.
The
And
clothier?
It was a dry goods store.
Mrs. Tilden was a social leader in Ames, and she always had to have the latest thing. So that was about the time that prairie-style houses were fashionable. So that's when they redid the outside, so that it was no longer.
But they didn't have a big family.
No,
Not
I'm sure they
particularly.
didn't. I don't know
2
how
or 3
many
kids
children they
maybe,
had.
But it was not a big family.
I know the Linderoths, from whom we bought it, had 2 daughters. But, no, she changed the character of the house completely.
Yeah, early pictures show it as a straight Italianate. It looked a lot like the house we owned right across the street.
Yeah.
And they changed it into prairie style by modernizing it, which this gal wanted done that way. It's interesting that it was a big estate. When we first moved here, a piece of our driveway curved over into that lawn slightly.
At the Svecs?
Yeah, and it was obvious that their driveway would come around and sweep across and empty where our driveway is. It's a big kind of a curved drive. And I always hated to take that out. We had to, but it was a little piece of history that I could imagine horse-drawn carriages and other things going down there.
But it's very interesting when you look at the abstract of this house, because the back part of it continually changed. So many feet off. Tilden would sell some and buy some back, and some of that was kind of during Depression time or afterward too. And there was quite a bit of changing of just not even where the houses were, just pieces of gardens. It looked like.
Yeah, yeah.
No, the whole back of that house is a suite of rooms. It is the master bedroom. The whole width of that house.
It was the east side of Douglas there on 9th. Was it pretty well maintained?
Oh, right across from
Yeah,
the
right
Svecs?
across.
No, it was there were 3 slumlord type houses.
That was 2 in there.
No, I think there were 3.
The Talbots lived on the corner.
Yeah, that's where Denise Denton
And it
was.
was nice.
That was nice.
And the opposite corner was nice, but in between there were some really ratty houses.
Yes.
And that was an
Even
issue.
when you lived there.
Yeah,
And there were designs to build a huge daycare
Oh,
center.
yes. You remember that?
oh gosh.
The huge
And
what?
daycare center.
Right
Yeah.
across the street from you.
Yeah, because the theory was the hospital workers would drop their kids off there and then go work at the hospital. And we put up a big fight about that, but we
Yeah.
didn't have much of a leg to stand on because the zoning would allow that.
And I wonder what happened to that proposal.
Well, I think the guy who promoted its financing kind of fell apart. And he later disappeared from the realty scene, and then it was sold and became what you see today, which is a pseudo
Yeah.
old bunch of buildings, but they're new.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Well,
Just, Mom, do you remember how much you paid for the house, 905 Douglas?
905.
Uh-huh.
She said that.
$3,800.
It had to be more than that. 3,000?
$3,800.
and you said so many cents.
And a few cents.
Mm-hmm.
$3,000?
Well, Kathy, you could buy a
1958?
hamburger for 10 cents.
That's
true.
nobody
Yes.
wanted
Now,
it.
what'd you pay for
That's
this
right.
house?
21.5.
21.5, and how many years later?
We bought it in '66.
About 20 years later.
20 years.
Well,
No, 50. They
21.
bought theirs in '58. We bought ours in
8.
'66. So it had gone up.
8 years.
Yeah, but there again, if you look at the consumer price index and all that,
And if they couldn't find a buyer,
Oh my God.
maybe, I mean, if it'd been on the market for a while.
yeah.
$1,000 for a house. Holy smokes.
Anyway.
Okay, you want to say anything or wrapping it up, Dick? or-
Oh, I don't know that I've got
Let's
anything.
reiterate the date. This is Thursday, the 2nd of August.
2010.
September. 2nd of September, 2010.
And we have 3 or 4, I guess 4 people here who have lived around the corner from each other.
Roger and Carol Volker have lived here since '67. Edna Svec, with the 9 children family and her husband, 58. They moved here in
And
1988.
when did you sell the house?
When?
30 years later.
1988.
Okay.
88.
58 to 88.
88, 30 years.
So the reason we're interviewing these people is they are some of the longest lived people in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
So there aren't many and that have lived here any longer than what you have.
Our children have such wonderful memories of living in that house. Oh,
Yeah.
the things that went on in that house. And the first thing we had to do after we moved in was put in an intercom.
Oh.
I going outside to summon our children to come for a meal, and I called and didn't get any answer. Couldn't figure out where these kids are, and it turned out they were all upstairs on 3rd floor. So Harry installed the intercom.
Hey, what's the age range of your children? How many years difference
They
between
were
the youngest and the oldest?
2 years between all of them, except Kathy came a little bit closer to the ones on each side of
So,
it.
so
So it's
eight-
about 18 years.
18 years. Wow.
Yep. And actually, Lillian was born at 905, right? Because she was born in 1960.
Yeah, she was born in 95.
So it was 8 kids that moved in, and then the ninth
Right,
one was
right.
born there
Hmm.
when we lived there. So that was an easy trip up to the hospital from.
Were your kids
905
born in
Douglas.
Mary Gridley?
Well, actually, our middle son was born there, but that's when we lived in student housing out of Iowa State.
Oh, okay.
And then we moved away, and then we came back, so.
I think the backstory on what we're talking about here might be an interesting thing to explore, because Harry was here as a graduate student working with Spedding and the Manhattan Project. And he knew Clifford Berry, the Adanasoff Berry computer guy,
Mm-hmm.
and he also knew Christian Peterson.
Mm.
And I believe Harry got some small studies that Christian Peterson created before he did some of the big. So he talk about people who knew everybody.
Was he a graduate student here then too?
He was.
So did he ever leave?
No,
Never left.
Got his master's and his PhD. And
Where
then
did he do his
worked
undergraduate?
Yeah, John Carroll University in Cleveland, Ohio.
And then came here for.
Came here for his entire professional career, starting with graduate school.
never left.
Never left.
And so what year would he have come?
Pardon me.
What year would he have come?
1940,
42.
41.
40 something.
Yeah.
Early 40s.
41
It was during,
or 2. It was
during
41 or
World
2.
War.
Yeah.
And then I came to graduate school, and I met him here.
Oh, you did.
Oh.
In what? And what was your major?
Institution management.
What does that mean? What's
It
the-
means you have large families.
That's why she had a large family.
Well, 11 people.
I'm a
That's how
very,
she marshaled all those kids
So-
to do things.
Hey, so he
I'm
was.
a very highly organized person.
Well,
You had to be.
He had to be. Hey, so he came from Ohio. And where'd you come from?
Pennsylvania.
What brought you to Iowa State?
Had a scholarship to come to graduate school here.
I see.
But she was also going to establish a new chapter of the Alpha Chi sorority. Wasn't that on
But
your agenda?
they would not, that was during the war. And they stipulated that to establish a fraternity or sorority that you had to have your own house. And at that time, that was not possible. So we gave up on that. So it was years later when somebody else came and did that.
Well, now, where'd you do your undergraduate work?
Penn State.
Penn State. And you never left either then, once you got here.
You know, and this is kind of interesting. When I got my master's degree, almost on the same day, Harry proposed marriage.
So you were stuck.
I was stuck. I was stuck. I was smitten.
Well, I don't have any other
Okay.
questions.
No, okay, thank you very, very much.
Sure.